The lights died in the tunnel. When they flickered back, he was there, tall, faceless, holding a heavy metal puncher. He grabbed the boy next to me and threw him through the closed doors into the void. Then came the sound. The wet pop and the crunch of every bone in his body being crushed in the dark. Now, he is turning toward me. Arthur sat heavily on the cracked leather seat of carriage number 412, his neck stiff as he leaned the back of his head against the vibrating glass. The window was a cold, unforgiving surface that hummed with the subterranean power of the engine, sending micro-tremors through his skull. Above the sliding doors, the analog clock ticked with a heavy, mechanical finality, its hands pointing to 11:42 in the evening. The air inside the carriage was stagnant, a suffocating blend of ancient dust, the chemical tang of scorched plastic, and that pervasive, metallic scent of ozone that exists only in the dark veins of the earth. The rhythmic grinding of steel wheels against the tracks evolved into a monotonous, hypnotic lullaby, burrowing through the layers of bone to settle deep within his brain. Every joint and seam in the rails announced itself with a muffled thud that resonated in Arthur's temples like a distant, underground heartbeat. He watched his own reflection in the dark glass, a pale, ghostly visage superimposed over the flickering lights of the tunnel. His fingers drummed a nervous, silent beat against his knees, the fabric of his trousers feeling rough and unnervingly dry against his skin. Directly across from him, an elderly woman sat as motionless as a museum exhibit, her features swallowed by the deep shadow of a low-slung hat. Her gloved hands were folded neatly over a tattered handbag, the knuckles appearing like gnarled roots beneath the fabric. In the far corner, a young man sat slumped with his chin tucked into his chest, eyes closed in a simulated sleep. From his oversized headphones, a thin, needle-like hiss of high-frequency static bled into the silence of the car, an irritating sound that felt like a tiny insect crawling inside Arthur's ear. The train hurtled through the absolute void of the tunnel, a silver needle piercing the black throat of the city. Beyond the glass, the gray concrete walls whipped past in a blur, occasionally revealing jagged patches of dampness or thick, black cables that coiled like sleeping serpents along the ceiling. Arthur caught fleeting glimpses of nonsensical graffiti, strange symbols, and jagged letters scrawled in faded paint that seemed to pulse in the strobe-like flashes of the passing service lights. It felt as though the tunnel was shrinking, the walls pressing closer to the glass with every mile of downward descent. Without warning, the familiar cadence of the voyage shattered into something discordant and wrong. A high-pitched, rising whistle began to scream from somewhere beneath the floorboards, a sound less like machinery and more like the agonized cry of a distant, prehistoric beast. The air pressure shifted violently, popping the eardrums of the passengers and making the very oxygen feel thin and metallic. Arthur gripped the edge of his seat, his knuckles turning white as the floor began to tilt at an impossible angle, throwing the equilibrium of the world into chaos. Then came the screech of the brakes, a sound so violent and visceral it felt like a physical assault. The brake pads bit into the spinning steel wheels with a nauseating, metallic shriek that vibrated through the marrow of Arthur's teeth. He instinctively clamped his palms over his ears, but the sound bypassed his hands, vibrating through his elbows and into his chest. The carriage lurched forward with a bone-jarring force, the momentum hurling the passengers toward the front of the car like dolls thrown by an angry child. The train groaned one final, metallic sigh and came to a dead halt, the silence that followed being even more terrifying than the noise. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the ticking of the cooling metal and the frantic, shallow breathing of the three souls trapped within the steel box. Arthur remained hunched over, his heart hammering against his ribs like a panicked bird trapped in a cage of bone. A single drop of cold sweat traced a path down his spine, leaving a trail of ice in its wake as the car settled into an unnatural, heavy stillness. Suddenly, the lone, flickering bulb in the ceiling sputtered with a dry, electric pop. It pulsed once, twice, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the faces of the passengers, before finally surrendering to the void. The darkness that rushed in was absolute, a thick, velvety weight that seemed to swallow the very concept of sight. In this new, sightless reality, the scent of rot and old wood began to rise from the floorboards, and the silence of the tunnel outside felt like a living thing, waiting patiently at the threshold of the closed doors. In the abrupt and total absence of light, sensation became a landscape of sharp, terrifying peaks. The first thing Arthur registered was the silence left behind by the dying bulb, a ringing void where the low hum of electricity used to be. The darkness was not empty, it was a physical presence, a thick, liquid blackness that poured into the carriage, filling every corner and pressing against his eyelids. He blinked once, twice, but his eyes found nothing to hold onto, no shape, no shadow, only an infinite, suffocating curtain of pure nothing. His pupils, dilated to their widest extent, searched desperately for a glimmer of differentiation in the gloom, but found only the same uniform, impenetrable void. The cold of the window against his head seemed to intensify, a focused point of frigid reality in a world that had dissolved into a sensory nightmare. Deprived of sight, his hearing sharpened to a painful degree. The carriage, once filled with the drone of motion, was now a soundstage for the terrifyingly intimate noises of the human body. He could hear the frantic, wet drumming of his own heart against the cage of his ribs, a panicked, trapped animal desperate for escape. The sound of his own breathing was a ragged, desperate rasp in his ears, each inhale a sharp catch of cold, heavy air, each exhale a shuddering release. He could feel the fine hairs on his arms standing on end, and the synthetic fabric of his jacket seemed to scrape against his skin with an abrasive, unnerving loudness. Every tiny, involuntary shift of his own body became an event, a source of sound that echoed in the profound stillness. From across the aisle, the silence was finally punctured by a dry, rattling cough from the elderly woman. It was a brittle, hollow sound, like stones being shaken in a wooden box, and it seemed to hang in the thick air for an impossibly long time before fading. Moments later, from the corner of the car, came a sharp, ragged intake of air from the young man, a gasp that was quickly stifled, as if he feared what might hear it. The sound was followed by a choked, wet silence, leaving Arthur to imagine the look of terror on the unseen face. No one spoke. No one dared to utter a word, as if a collective, primal understanding had passed between them. To speak would be to give their location away to whatever now shared the darkness with them. The air itself seemed to transform, growing heavy and pregnant with moisture. It was as if the tunnel itself had exhaled its ancient, subterranean breath into their steel prison, a miasma of dank earth, century-old water, and something else, something cloying and organic beneath it all. A subtle, sweet odor of decay began to rise from the floorboards, the scent of rot and forgotten things. Arthur could feel the change on his skin, a clammy dampness that settled over him like a shroud. The cracked leather of the seat beneath him felt slick and cold, and the air he drew into his lungs was thick and unsatisfying, like breathing in grave dirt. The claustrophobia was a physical weight now, pressing down on his chest and constricting his throat. The silence that followed the cough and the gasp was of a different quality. It was a dense, expectant hush, so profound that it felt tangible, a pressure against his eardrums. He could almost feel the texture of it, like the cold, slick slime that coats the walls of a long-abandoned well. In this new quiet, time began to warp and stretch. Arthur tried to count the seconds in his head, to anchor himself to the familiar rhythm of the clock, but he lost track almost immediately. The seconds elongated into minutes, and the minutes stretched into vast, empty chasms of waiting. What could have been 5 minutes felt like an hour, an entire evening spent suspended in this cold, dark purgatory deep beneath the waking world. His mind began to play tricks on him, conjuring faint, imagined whispers from the edges of his hearing. Then, a new sound began, and this one was not from inside the carriage. It started as a faint, dry rustling from outside, somewhere along the length of the train. It was a sound that defied easy identification, a soft, chitinous skittering, like a mountain of dead leaves being stirred by a slow, deliberate wind, or the impossibly amplified sound of 1,000 insects crawling over a concrete floor. It was a patient, exploratory sound, and it seemed to be moving. Arthur held his breath, straining his ears, tilting his head as he tried to pinpoint its source. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, a whispering, scraping texture that surrounded them, a sound that spoke of something impossibly large and possessing far too many legs. The rustling grew fractionally louder, closer. Arthur could now discern a dragging component to the sound, the heavy scrape of something dense being pulled slowly across the rough floor of the tunnel. He imagined something immense and segmented, its body brushing against the concrete walls as it moved with an unnerving, deliberate slowness. He pressed his ear against the cold glass of the window, a desperate attempt to gain more information, but the vibration of the sound was now so pervasive that it seemed to be coming from the very floor beneath his feet. A tremor started in his hands, a fine, uncontrollable vibration that he tried to still by clenching his fists until his knuckles ached. The rustling stopped directly outside their carriage. What followed was a sudden, heavy impact against the side of the train car. It was not a sharp, metallic clang, but a deep, resonant thud, a wet, fleshy sound, as if a colossal side of meat had been thrown against the steel. The entire carriage shuddered from the force of the blow, a low groan of stressed metal echoing through the small space. The floor vibrated violently under Arthur's feet, and he instinctively drew his legs up onto the seat, away from the source of the impact. The young man in the corner let out a small, terrified whimper, a sound that was immediately swallowed by the profound silence that descended once more. This new silence was the most terrifying of all. It was not empty, but filled with a menacing presence. The shuffling was gone, but the knowledge of what had made it remained, now silent, now waiting just outside the thin metal wall. Arthur's imagination, fueled by the darkness, painted horrific images of what lay just inches from his face, on the other side of the glass. The air grew colder still, and the smell of rot intensified, now mingled with the sharp, electric scent of ozone, a smell of unnatural energies and lightning striking dead earth. He could feel a scream building in his throat, a raw, primal noise of pure terror, but his muscles were locked, frozen by a paralysis that went deeper than conscious thought. Just as the pressure in his chest became unbearable, just as the scream was about to tear itself from his lungs, the light returned. But it was not the familiar, warm, yellowish glow of the carriage bulb. This was a dead light, a sickly, pale, and wavering luminescence that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, like a dying heart. It emanated from no visible source, simply filling the car with its cadaverous, blue-white radiance. The light did not illuminate, it exposed. It stripped all warmth and color from the world, rendering everything in stark, morbid shades of gray and black. Under this horrifying new light, the world of the carriage was transformed into a waking mortuary. The scuffed floors looked like polished bone, and the advertisements on the walls seemed like faded epitaphs on a tombstone. Arthur looked across at the other passengers, and a fresh wave of cold dread washed over him. Their faces, bleached of all color by the pulsating, ghostly light, looked like wax masks. Their eyes were wide, black pools of terror set in unnaturally pale skin. They were no longer fellow travelers, but effigies in a mausoleum, their shared horror frozen on their faces by the cold, unforgiving glow of the subterranean world that had now claimed them. It was Arthur who saw it first. His eyes, now painfully adjusted to the morbid, pulsing twilight, had completed a slow, desperate scan of their steel cage. He saw the elderly woman across the aisle, a statue carved from fear, her gloved hands gripping her purse so tightly that the worn leather had to be groaning in protest. He saw the young man in the corner, no longer slumped in feigned sleep but coiled into a tight ball, his face a mask of chalky terror. And then, his gaze traveled to the far end of the carriage, to the sealed connecting doors, and his blood went cold. There, standing in a space that had been unequivocally empty only moments before, was a new passenger. Its presence was a violation of the cramped, horizontal space of the carriage. The figure was impossibly tall, a severe, vertical line of darkness that drew the eye and held it captive. Its head, a featureless ovoid shape in the gloom, was so high that it almost scraped the curved, grimy ceiling, forcing it into a subtle, unnatural stoop. The sheer scale of it was wrong, a thing of open spaces and high ceilings inexplicably confined within this subterranean tube. It remained perfectly still, a silent monolith that seemed to have materialized from the very shadows that the sickly light cast, its form absorbing the pale glow rather than reflecting it. The air around it seemed thinner, colder, as if its very existence was drawing the heat and life from the carriage. The creature was dressed in the immaculate, dark blue uniform of a conductor from a bygone era. The fabric was a deep, matte navy that seemed to swallow the pulsating light, showing no folds or wrinkles, only a perfect, severe tailoring that spoke of an impossible discipline. A double row of silver buttons ran down the front of the jacket, but they did not gleam. Under the cadaverous light, they were like small, polished discs of absolute blackness, tiny voids that seemed to pull at the surrounding illumination. They were not ornaments but absences, holes punched through the fabric of reality. The entire uniform was pristine, untouched by the grime and decay that coated every other surface in the carriage, a stark and terrifying contrast to its surroundings. But it was the face, or the utter lack of one, that shattered Arthur's sanity. Where the features of a human being should have been, the familiar geography of eyes, nose, and mouth, there was nothing. Only a smooth, taut, and unbroken plane of skin, the color and texture of ancient, yellowed parchment stretched tight over a frame of bone. There was no hint of a mouth beneath the surface, no suggestion of sealed eyes. It was a perfect, placid, and horrifyingly blank canvas. The pulsing light slid across this surface, revealing the sharp, angular topography of the skull beneath, the prominent ridges of the brow, the high, sharp cheekbones, the unforgiving curve of the jaw. It was a human skull, draped in a seamless shroud of skin. A knot of ice formed in the pit of Arthur's stomach, and the acidic taste of bile rose in the back of his throat. In one of its hands, the figure held a heavy, metallic ticket puncher. It was an antiquated, brutal-looking instrument of steel and iron, its jaws thick and capable of shearing through more than just paper. The cold light glinted dully off its worn surfaces, revealing scratches and dents from a century of use. The figure's fingers, impossibly long and thin, were wrapped around the handle. As Arthur watched, paralyzed, those fingers tightened. The mechanism of the puncher engaged with a single, shockingly loud sound, a percussive, metallic clank that was not a click, but a heavy, final sound, like a jail cell door slamming shut or the fall of a small, steel guillotine. The noise cut through the silence, an announcement of purpose, a declaration of the ritual that was about to begin. Then, it began to move. The motion was deeply unsettling, a smooth, fluid glide that was completely divorced from the act of walking. Its head remained at the same exact height, never bobbing or weaving, as it floated down the central aisle. It was as if it were being pulled along on some unseen track, a spectral automaton set upon its course. The movement was silent, graceful, and utterly terrifying in its efficiency. It passed the first row of empty seats, its dark form a flowing river of shadow that seemed to bend the pale light around it. Arthur found he could not look away, his eyes locked on the gliding horror, his own body feeling leaden and clumsy in comparison. Yet, contradicting the weightless, silent grace of its movement was a sound. With each forward glide, a soft, wet, and deeply organic noise emanated from the floor beneath it. It was a quiet, rhythmic squelch, like the sound of a heavy boot pulling itself free from thick, viscous mud, or the sound of stepping on something wet and yielding in the dark. The sound was a visceral violation of the creature's ethereal motion, a disgusting anchor to some physical, putrid reality. Arthur's mind recoiled from the implication, from the impossible marriage of a silent glide and a wet, sucking step. The smell of damp earth and decay seemed to intensify with each squelch, a foul miasma that followed in the creature's wake. The creature glided past the elderly woman, its blank face remaining fixed straight ahead, its trajectory unaltered. The woman shrank back into her seat, making herself impossibly small, her face turned away as if refusing to witness the thing would render her invisible. But the figure paid her no mind. Its purpose was singular, its destination clear. It continued its smooth, squelching advance down the aisle, a relentless and inevitable force. Arthur felt a fleeting, shameful wave of relief as it passed the woman, a feeling that was immediately replaced by a surge of cold dread as he realized its target. It was moving directly towards the young man huddled in the corner. The young man was frozen, a specimen of pure terror pinned against the wall. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were locked on the approaching figure. His mouth was slightly agape, a small, choked sound caught in his throat. He clutched his backpack to his chest like a child's security blanket, a flimsy and pathetic shield against the encroaching nightmare. The headphones had slipped from his ears and now hung uselessly around his neck, their tinny, escaping hiss a ridiculous counterpoint to the profound, dreadful silence of the car. A fine sheen of sweat coated his forehead, gleaming like oil in the pulsating, morgue-like light. His entire body trembled with a fine, high-frequency vibration, a machine on the verge of shaking itself apart. The figure came to a stop directly in front of him, its immense height casting him in a deep, chilling shadow. It stood there for a long, silent moment, a predator observing its cornered prey. The wet squelching sound ceased, replaced by the thundering of Arthur's own blood in his ears. Then, slowly, with a deliberate and unhurried motion, the creature raised its free hand. The hand was a thing of anatomical horror, the skin pale and stretched taut over the bones, the knuckles like polished stones. The fingers were the worst part, they were unnaturally long and slender, each joint pronounced, ending in clean, spade-like nails. It was a spider's leg, a skeletal appendage. The figure extended this hand towards the boy, palm up, and held it there, motionless, in a gesture of silent, unassailable demand. It waited. The young man reacted to the silent, outstretched hand with a convulsive shudder, a jolt of pure animal terror that ran through him like a current of electricity. His entire body seemed to shrink, compressing itself into the corner as if he could somehow merge with the cold metal and plastic of the carriage wall. A low, guttural noise escaped his throat, a sound of strangled protest that was less than a word, more the sound of a spring being wound too tight. His terrified eyes darted from the featureless face of the conductor to the skeletal, waiting hand, and then back again, trapped in a feedback loop of disbelief and horror. For a moment, he remained utterly frozen, a statue of fear, before the implicit threat of the gesture finally broke through his paralysis. With a series of jerky, uncoordinated movements, he began to fumble at the pockets of his jacket. His hands trembled so violently that they seemed to be a blur in the pulsating, ghostly light. The sound of his frantic patting against the nylon fabric was loud and obscene in the oppressive silence of the carriage, a desperate, pathetic drumming that broadcast his terror to the still air. He tried one pocket, then another, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps that were almost sobs. Arthur watched, every muscle in his own body tensed, feeling a sympathetic, phantom tremor in his own hands. The conductor remained perfectly still, its hand extended, a monument of infinite, unfeeling patience. Finally, the young man's trembling fingers found purchase and pulled a small, crumpled rectangle of paper from an inner pocket. It was a simple paper ticket, creased and softened from a day spent in transit. It looked flimsy and inadequate, a pathetic talisman against the immense, silent horror that stood before him. His fingers, slick with a film of cold sweat, could not maintain their grip. The ticket slipped, a tiny white flag of surrender, and began its slow, fluttering descent towards the grimy floor of the carriage. It seemed to hang in the air for an eternity, tumbling end over end in the dead, heavy atmosphere, before finally coming to rest beside the creature's immaculate, dark shoes. It lay there, face up, a meaningless contract in a lawless new reality. The silence that followed the ticket's soft landing was absolute. The young man stared at it, his face a canvas of utter despair, as if he had just dropped his own soul into a bottomless pit. And then, the tall figure began to bend. The movement was a slow, deliberate violation of anatomy. It did not bend at the waist or knees like a human would. Instead, its long, rigid spine seemed to curve impossibly, its entire upper torso lowering itself towards the floor in a single, fluid, and deeply unnatural arc. As it inclined its head, a series of sounds emanated from deep within its neck, a dry, deliberate cracking, like the sound of old, brittle branches being carefully and methodically snapped, one by one. It was the sound of ancient, dry vertebrae grinding against one another, a sound that spoke of an age and a physiology that did not belong in the world. Its long, spider-like fingers, with their clean, spade-shaped nails, descended upon the ticket. It did not pinch the paper between two fingers. Instead, all 5 digits made contact at once, seeming to adhere to the surface for a moment before lifting it from the floor with a preternatural delicacy. The creature then began to straighten, its spine uncoiling with the same slow, horrifying fluidity, the dry crackling in its neck repeating in reverse order. It brought the small, crumpled ticket up towards its blank face, holding it only inches from the smooth, parchment-like skin. It held it there, in the space where I should have been, and tilted its head fractionally, as if in contemplation. In the pulsating, sickly light, Arthur could see the faint, dark lines of the ticket's text reflected on the featureless surface of the creature's face, a meaningless scrawl on a canvas of bone and skin. The silence stretched, becoming a high-pitched, ringing pressure in Arthur's ears. The universe seemed to hold its breath. Then, the sound came. The creature's other hand, the one holding the heavy steel puncher, tightened its grip. With a single, sharp, and brutally final motion, it brought the jaws of the instrument down on the ticket. The sound was not a click, but a heavy, percussive clank, a sound of industrial finality, of metal shearing through paper and purpose. It was the sound of a verdict being rendered, of a gate being irrevocably locked. Immediately following the metallic sound, a long, low sigh seemed to emanate from the creature's chest, a sound like a slow leak from a vast, ancient bellows. It was not the sound of breathing, but of some internal pressure being equalized, a task now complete. The ritual was over. The conductor lowered both of its hands to its sides, the now validated ticket held neatly beside the puncher. Then, with the same smooth, gliding motion as before, it turned. It pivoted not on its feet, but from its core, its entire body rotating to face the closed sliding doors of the carriage. It glided the few feet to the doors, its passage marked by that same quiet, wet squelching from beneath its perfect shoes. It stopped directly before the thick, reinforced glass and steel. It did not search for a handle or a button. It simply raised one long, skeletal finger and touched the very center of the door, where the two panels met. Without a sound, without the hiss of pneumatics or the hum of a motor, the heavy doors slid open. They parted with a silent, impossible grace, revealing not the familiar concrete wall of a tunnel, but a perfect, yawning abyss of absolute blackness. It was a darkness more profound than the one they had just endured, a solid, tangible void that seemed to suck the very light and air from the carriage. A gust of cold, foul air billowed into the car, carrying with it the smell of stagnant water, of deep, wet earth, and of something else, something metallic and raw, like a butcher's shop left open to the elements for a week. The conductor turned its head, its featureless face fixing upon the young man. Before he could react, before he could even process the opening of the door, the creature moved with a speed that was utterly blinding. It shot out a long arm and its pale fingers wrapped around the collar of the boy's jacket. The sound of the fabric straining was the only noise. The young man didn't scream. He didn't have time. A single, wide-eyed look of complete, soul-shattering comprehension was the only expression he managed before he was lifted from his seat as if he were a thing of straw and air. With an incredible, effortless display of force, the conductor flung him outwards, through the open doorway and into the waiting, silent void. His form was swallowed by the blackness in an instant. For a single, heart-stopping moment, there was only silence. Arthur sat frozen, every nerve fiber screaming, his body pressed so hard against the cracked leather of his seat that he felt it might absorb him. Then, the sounds began to echo back from the darkness of the tunnel. First, there was a wet, percussive splat, a sickening impact of soft tissue against a hard, unyielding surface. This was followed immediately by a chorus of distinct, dry cracks, a sound of profound structural failure, like a large, thick tree branch being snapped over a knee, or a bag of walnuts being crushed under a heavy stone. It was the unmistakable, intimate sound of a skeleton coming apart. The cracking subsided, replaced by a new series of noises that were somehow even more horrific. A wet, tearing, chomping sound began, rhythmic and industrious. It was a sound of feeding, of something immense and hungry working its way through flesh and sinew. This was accompanied by a heavy, dragging scrape, the noise of a significant weight being laboriously pulled across the rough concrete floor of the tunnel, deeper into the darkness. Arthur's stomach revolted, and he clamped a hand over his mouth, fighting back the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm him. The sounds from the tunnel continued for a few moments longer before fading into the oppressive silence once more. As quietly and smoothly as they had opened, the carriage doors slid shut, sealing the three of them, no, the two of them, back inside their sterile, illuminated tomb. The air was thick with the lingering stench of the tunnel and the phantom echo of the horrors they had just heard. The corner seat, where the young man had been only a minute ago, was now empty. His backpack lay on its side, a pathetic, mundane relic of a life that had just been violently extinguished. The conductor stood motionless before the closed doors for a beat, and then, with that same terrifyingly fluid grace, it turned. Its blank, parchment-skinned face pivoted, and its unseen attention drifted across the aisle, settling upon its next destination. The elderly woman. The conductor's blank, parchment-skinned face pivoted away from the sealed doors, a slow, hydraulic motion that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. The unseen gaze swept past the empty corner seat, a space now defined by a profound and violent absence, and continued its arc across the aisle. As that featureless mask turned, Arthur felt a primal, cold dread seize his nervous system, a biological certainty that he was being observed, assessed, and condemned by something that had no capacity for sight, yet saw everything. The thing began to move again, not towards him, but towards the elderly woman, its passage marked by that same obscene, wet squelching that seemed to defy the physics of its otherwise silent, weightless glide. The movement acted as a catalyst, shattering Arthur's paralysis and plunging him into a maelstrom of frantic, desperate action. A spasm of pure, animal panic seized him, the instinct to survive overriding every rational thought. His hands, suddenly feeling like clumsy, foreign appendages, began a feverish search of his own pockets. He slapped his palms against the thick wool of his overcoat, the sound a series of dull, panicked thuds in the silent carriage. His fingers dug deep, finding only the cold, sharp edges of his house keys and the soft, useless fluff of pocket lint. The fabric of his trousers felt rough and abrasive as he fumbled, his mind a screaming white noise of a single, repeating thought, the ticket, where is the ticket? His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, syncopated rhythm that felt loud enough to be heard across the aisle. A film of cold, slick sweat bloomed on his forehead and the back of his neck, pasting his collar to his skin. He shoved a hand into his jacket's inner pocket, his knuckles scraping against the rough stitching. For a terrifying moment, his fingers found nothing but smooth lining, and a wave of absolute, gut-wrenching despair washed over him. And then, he felt it. A thin, rectangular edge of hard plastic, cool and unyielding. Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through him. With trembling fingers, he pinched the edge of the card and wrenched it from the pocket, its slick surface almost causing him to drop it as he had seen the young man do. He held the card in both hands, his thumbs smudging the surface, as if it were a holy relic that could ward off the encroaching evil. It was his monthly transit pass. The pulsating, cadaverous light of the carriage slid across its laminated surface, making the familiar Transit Authority logo seem alien and menacing. His own photograph, taken on a grim morning years ago, stared back at him with the eyes of a stranger. But he ignored all of that, his attention fixed on the small, printed text at the bottom. His breath caught in his throat as he forced his eyes to focus on the string of words, his mind struggling to process them. Valid until midnight. The 24th of December, 2025. Today. The pass was valid until midnight of this very day. A surge of desperate, fragile relief coursed through him, so potent it left him feeling weak and dizzy. He was safe. He had a valid ticket. He was not like the boy. But the relief was fleeting, instantly chased away by a new, more urgent horror. He tore his eyes from the card and looked up at the clock on the wall above the doors. Its yellowed plastic face seemed to grin at him in the sickly light, its severe black hands positioned like the arms of a merciless judge. The hour hand was on the 11, the minute hand a single, hair's breadth from the 12. It was 11:59. The long, thin second hand was sweeping its way around the dial with a dreadful, inexorable purpose. In the profound silence of the carriage, the sound of the clock's mechanism was monstrously amplified. Each tick was not a delicate click, but a heavy, percussive thud that seemed to shake the very air. It was the sound of a judge's gavel falling, again and again, each strike a nail being driven into a coffin lid. It was the sound of a blacksmith's hammer on a cold anvil, forging the final, unbreakable links of a chain. Arthur could feel the rhythm of it in his teeth, a deep, resonant throb that synchronized with the frantic, terrified beating of his own heart. 60 seconds. He had less than 60 seconds before his proof of passage, his token of legitimacy, turned to worthless plastic in his hands. The second hand continued its merciless march, a black scythe sweeping away the final moments of his salvation. While Arthur was trapped in this temporal nightmare, the conductor had reached its destination. It glided to a halt before the elderly woman, its immense, dark form completely eclipsing her small frame. She did not recoil or scream. Instead, she seemed to be possessed by a great and terrible calm, a resignation that was more horrifying than any panic. She looked up at the blank, parchment face, and her own expression was one of weary acceptance, as if she were meeting a long-expected appointment. Her gloved hands, which had been clutching her purse, slowly opened. With a steady, deliberate movement that defied the terror of the situation, she reached into the purse and retrieved a small slip of paper. She held it out to the waiting figure. Arthur's eyes, wide with a mixture of his own panic and a morbid curiosity, focused on the offering. It was not a modern ticket. It was a small, rectangular piece of cardstock, yellowed with age to the color of old bone, its corners soft and frayed. The ink was faded, a ghostly brown against the jaundiced paper. Even from across the aisle, under the unreliable, pulsing light, he could make out the date, printed in an old-fashioned, serif font. The 20th of May, 1980. The ticket was more than 4 decades old, an artifact from a different world, a ghost of a journey taken long before the young man had even been born. The conductor did not immediately take the ancient ticket. It paused, its featureless head tilting down to gaze upon the offering. For a long, silent moment, it simply stood there, and the air in the carriage grew thick with an unspoken question. The established ritual had been broken. Then, a new sound began to emanate from the creature, a low, deep, and resonant hum that seemed to originate from somewhere deep within its chest. It was not an organic sound, but the sound of powerful, ancient machinery waking from a long slumber, the sound of a massive electrical transformer charging with immense power. The hum vibrated through the floor of the carriage, a physical pressure that Arthur could feel in the soles of his feet and the base of his spine. The creature finally took the ticket, its long, skeletal fingers closing over the brittle paper with impossible gentleness. It did not raise the ticket puncher. The humming from its chest grew slightly in pitch and volume. Then, it did something else. It did not turn to the doors. Instead, it raised its free hand and slowly, deliberately, placed it upon the woman's shoulder. It repeated the gesture with its other hand, its two pale, spidery appendages resting on the thin fabric of her old-fashioned coat. The moment its fingers made contact, the transformation began. It did not happen all at once, but started at the points of contact, spreading outwards like a stain. The woman's form began to lose its solidity. Her edges, once sharp and defined in the cold light, began to blur and waver, like a reflection in disturbed water. The texture of her coat, the lines of her face, the very substance of her being seemed to unravel, dissolving not into dust, but into a thick, swirling gray smoke. It was a process of silent, horrifying unmaking. A faint, dry scent filled the air, the smell of ancient dust, of long-closed rooms, of faded perfume and the brittle pages of a forgotten book. The woman did not make a sound. Her expression of calm acceptance remained fixed as her features dissolved into the roiling gray mist. The gray smoke did not rise to the ceiling or dissipate into the air. Instead, it was drawn inwards, pulled by some unseen force towards the conductor's dark uniform. The thick, viscous tendrils of mist flowed like water, swirling and coiling before touching the deep blue fabric. The material did not become wet or stained. It simply absorbed the smoke, drinking it in as a desert drinks the rain. The matte blue of the uniform seemed to deepen, to grow infinitesimally darker and richer, saturated with the essence of what had once been a human life. In a matter of seconds, she was completely gone. The space where she had sat was now utterly empty, the worn leather of the seat bearing no trace that she had ever existed at all. The hum from the conductor's chest slowly faded back into silence. It stood motionless for a single, long beat, its hands now resting at its sides. The space it occupied seemed darker, more substantial than before. Then, with the same smooth, inevitable, and horrifying grace, it began to turn. Its entire body pivoted, the sound of the wet squelch from the floor returning with a sickening familiarity. Its blank, parchment-skinned face, now somehow fuller, completed its slow, deliberate rotation, the unseen, all-seeing void of its attention finally coming to rest upon the last remaining passenger. It was now Arthur's turn. He looked from the empty seat to the impassive, terrifying figure, and then, in a final, desperate act, his eyes shot back to the clock on the wall. The long, black second hand, the arbiter of his fate, had completed its journey. It touched the number 12 with a final, definitive thud, and then it stopped. The hammering sound that had filled the carriage was gone. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute, a silence of the grave. The minute hand clicked forward, perfectly aligned with the 12. It was midnight. The first moment of the 25th of December. His ticket had just expired. The final, definitive thud of the clock's second hand was not just a sound, but a physical event that seemed to alter the very substance of reality within the carriage. The oppressive, hammering rhythm that had become the world's heartbeat was gone, and the silence it left behind was a vacuum, cold and absolute. In this new, profound stillness, the conductor took its first step towards Arthur. It was a single, fluid, gliding motion, yet it covered half the distance between them in an instant. As it moved, a wave of profound, unnatural cold radiated outwards from it, a tangible aura of the grave that washed over Arthur in a suffocating tide. The air, already stale and heavy, became instantly frigid. Arthur gasped, and his breath plumed before his face in a thick, white cloud of vapor, a fleeting ghost of his own life force in the freezing air. His body, acting on a desperate, vestigial instinct for self-preservation, completed the motion he had begun. His arm, trembling with a violent, uncontrollable tremor, extended the plastic transit pass towards the approaching figure. The card felt impossibly flimsy in his grasp, a pathetic, modern ward against a horror that was timeless and absolute. He held it out into the encroaching cold, his knuckles white, his entire being focused on this single, desperate gesture of appeasement. He could feel the cold intensifying as the creature drew nearer, a penetrating chill that seeped through the layers of his clothing and into the marrow of his bones. He could feel the cold radiating from the creature's long, pale fingers before they had even made contact, a palpable field of absolute zero that leached the warmth from his own skin. The conductor's skeletal fingers closed around the card. There was no sensation of touch, no pressure of skin against plastic, only a sudden, shocking intensification of the cold, a pain so sharp it was like being branded with ice. The creature took the card from his nerveless grasp, its movements imbued with a serene and terrible purpose. Arthur's eyes were fixed on the other hand, the one holding the heavy, metallic puncher. He waited, every muscle in his body coiled tight, for the sound. He braced himself for the brutal, definitive clank that would seal his fate, the sound that had preceded the young man's horrific end. He waited for the judgment, for the shearing of metal through plastic, for the final verdict to be rendered in a single, percussive instant. But the sound never came. The creature simply held the card in one hand and the puncher in the other, both resting at its sides. A profound, terrifying stillness descended once more. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it tilted its featureless head to the side. The movement was accompanied by that same series of dry, cracking sounds from within its neck, the sound of ancient, brittle vertebrae grinding against each other. It was a gesture not of confusion, but of cold, alien contemplation. Arthur's gaze, drawn by a morbid gravity he could not resist, fell upon the transit pass in the creature's spidery grasp. And his blood, which had already turned to ice in his veins, seemed to freeze solid. The card was no longer his. The familiar logo, his own grim photograph, the line of text that had been his salvation and then his damnation, it was all gone. The plastic was a perfect, uniform, and virginal white, as smooth and featureless as the face that now contemplated it. It was the color of scoured bone. A new, more profound horror began to dawn, a terror that transcended the simple fear of death. He tore his gaze from the blank card and looked up at the clock on the wall. The hands were no longer still. They were moving, not forward, but backward, with a frantic, impossible speed. The second hand was a black blur, the minute and hour hand spinning in a furious, silent vortex, unwinding the minutes, the hours, the days. Time itself was coming undone, reality collapsing in on itself, and he was at the epicenter. As he stared, mesmerized by the temporal chaos, he felt a presence beside him. The conductor had glided the final few feet to his seat. Slowly, with the weight of eternity, the creature raised its free hand, the one that was not holding the bleached white card, and placed it upon Arthur's shoulder. It was not a violent or aggressive touch. It was a gesture of ownership, of claim. The cold was absolute, a void that did not just touch his skin but plunged deep into his soul, extinguishing the last, flickering embers of his identity. In that moment of contact, his perception of the world shattered. He understood, with a clarity that was a form of madness, that the train was not in a tunnel. It had never been in a tunnel. He turned his head and looked out the window, but the fleeting, grimy concrete wall was gone. In its place was a vast and terrifying emptiness, a cosmic ocean of absolute blackness, deeper and more profound than any night. And in this unspace, suspended in the silent, starless void, were other trains. Hundreds of them. Perhaps thousands. A ghostly, silent armada of identical carriages, each one bathed in the same sickly, pulsating, blue-white light, each one filled with silent, motionless passengers, their faces pale and still like his own. And in each and every carriage, standing impassively amongst its silent cargo, was a tall, severe figure in a dark blue conductor's uniform. It was not an anomaly. It was a system. A harvest. The creature did not throw him into the void. His fate was not to be food for the things that scuttled in the dark. Its purpose for him was something else entirely. The skeletal hand on his shoulder remained, a permanent anchor of cold. The other hand, the one holding the blank, white card, slowly rose and pointed. It did not point to the doors, but forward, towards the front of the carriage. Arthur's gaze followed the impossibly long, pale finger. The opaque partition that had separated the passenger car from the driver's cabin was now perfectly transparent, a pane of clear glass revealing the space beyond. In the driver's seat, a man was slumped over the controls. His skin was unnaturally pale, and he was dressed in the same severe, dark blue uniform. As Arthur watched, he saw the man's face begin to change, the features, the lines around the eyes, the curve of the nose, the set of the mouth, slowly softening, melting, and receding into the pale flesh, the skin stretching taut and smooth, erasing the identity that lay beneath. A strange, tingling sensation began around Arthur's own eyes, a feeling of pressure from within, as if the skin itself were beginning to grow, to stretch, to crawl inwards with a life of its own, eager to seal the useless windows of his soul. As the physical transformation began, a far more terrifying erasure was happening within his mind. His memories, the very pillars of his existence, began to crumble into dust. The image of his home, the sound of his wife's laughter, the feeling of the sun on his face, they all dissolved into a meaningless, gray fog. His own name became a foreign, unpronounceable sound that slipped away from him like water through cupped hands. And as the old knowledge vanished, a new knowledge settled in its place, cold, hard, and immutable. He knew the schedule. He knew the stops. He knew the weight of the steel puncher in his hand and the final, satisfying authority of its metallic clank. A low, resonant groan shuddered through the carriage, not the familiar rumble of forward motion, but a deep, foundational shift. The carriage was not moving forward, it was descending. It began a slow, inexorable plunge downwards, not into the earth, but through it, a journey into a place where time was a meaningless, spinning wheel, and where the only law was the validity of a ticket. He was no longer Arthur. He was a conductor. He slowly, deliberately, raised his right hand before his face, a face that was quickly becoming a smooth, blank canvas. He watched, with a calm and profound sense of purpose, as his fingers seemed to stretch and thin, the knuckles becoming pronounced, the nails hardening into clean, spade-like shapes. His hand was becoming a tool, an instrument of the system, ready for the long shift ahead. The journey of carriage number 412 was not over. It was just beginning. And it would never, ever end.